He arrived 15 minutes early. The way a person arrives when his name is inked at the top of a program and the house lights are counting down to him. For weeks, he had imagined the moment the curtains would draw, the hush would spread like a ripple through velvet seats, and the first slide, a map of a nation's arteries, would flare into light behind him. Instead, he met a palm pressed flat against his chest and a sentence that landed like a verdict. VIPs only. He said it twice, the guard, and slower the second time, as if repetition would soften the mistake into obedience. The badge around. The visitor's neck was thick laminated and unmissable. Keynote. The suit was cut with the quiet care of someone who'd measured and saved for it. The hard case at his side held a talk that had consumed 3 months of life and love. None of that mattered. In a hallway built to glide important people toward important moments, one man's eyes scanned his face and sorted him into a category. That wasn't belong. He had walked this corridor before, not in this building, not on this carpet, not under this chandelier, and yet always the same corridor, always the same question uncoiling in the space between what he was and what he was assumed to be. Behind him, the murmur of other bodies. Ahead, a velvet rope that separated credentials from credibility, and credibility from the caprice of a gaze. Dr. Malik Okafor was the name printed on the program in a typeface that would project cleanly on screens. His talk would explain why systems fail and how to make them care for people. In the minutes that followed, he would show an audience exactly what he meant, not with slides or statistics, but with a door that said no to the person it had been erected to welcome. The story would travel far beyond the lights. It would become an unplanned preface to the keynote itself. How bias breaks systems long before any circuit does. Long before the velvet ropes and the headsets and the practiced calm of backstage, there was a kitchen table crowded with parts that came from radios, and printers and patient thrift store rescues. In a small Columbus apartment, a boy and his father made Saturday mornings into a ritual. They lifted lids off machines the world had stopped believing in, and they learned the inside names for the pulses that made everyday life hum. His father, a quiet man whose own father had mended bicycles for strangers in a town with one paved road, loved the way circuits carried intention, the elegant certainty that a signal, properly guided, would find its way. On the fridge hung multiplication, tables and spelling lists and masking tape that peeled and curled at the edges. Beneath them, a calendar marked with the night shifts his mother worked at the hospital. She split her days in two to sit with the boy over fractions and stories. And when exhaustion lined her face, she laughed at it. And when unfairness came home in the shape of another nurse who got the raise and the praise, she folded it into a lesson and slid it across the table. People can be wrong about you and still have power. Learn their names, learn your worth, and don't confuse the two. At 14, after a summer storm blacked out 3 school buildings, the boy rewired a switch that brought the lab back to life. At 17, he built an air monitoring sensor, with parts scavenged from the recycling bin behind a big box store. At 19, he spent a summer in a federal lab where he fell in love with infrastructure, bridges that held more than weight, networks that carried more than data, power grids that buzzed like nervous systems. He loved how systems touched people, quietly, invisibly, and how a single overlooked assumption could, years later, ripple out to become the reason someone's oxygen machine flickered off in a heat wave. He graduated and kept learning, and at each step undergraduate, master's, doctorate, he also learned the things that weren't in the syllabus. He learned to over-prepare for meetings and arrive early for flights and to carry a backup of his backup talk, because redundancy is how you survive both systems failure and social doubt. He learned the difference between "can I help you?" and "can I help you?" and the ways a question can be a gate. He learned the careful economy of breath it takes to explain, politely, repeatedly, that you are the person you already introduced yourself to be. In the labs and conference rooms where he built a career, he collected stories like other people collected paperweights from conferences. There was the colleague mistaken for catering at her own panel, who served the tray and then served the audience a tornado of grace and evidence. There was the tenured professor asked to produce ID twice on his own campus, watched by students, who took notes on how to shrink. There was the doctor on a flight whose willingness to help and insistence on being heard remade a policy at 30,000 feet. He learned how these stories felt from the inside. A raised eyebrow at the security desk, a guard's quick hand at your chest, the hot flash of humiliation that becomes cold in your bones. For 15 years, he married the morality that had been poured into him at the kitchen table with the engineering that had been poured into him in classrooms and labs. He built teams. He published papers. He learned that leadership is a way of being seen and of making others seen. When the Global Systems Summit called, it felt like a circle tightening into a smaller, brighter loop. Come tell us how to keep what we build from breaking, and how to keep the breaking from finding the same people first. He did what he always did. He wrote the talk and threw it away twice, then rewrote it in the plainest language he could find, because power recognizes itself when it is called by everyday names. He rehearsed the cadence until it fit into the bones of his breath. He packed his case with a spare blazer and an extra shirt and a slide advancer he trusted. And he booked a ticket with a buffer that would protect the talk from delays and fun, protect his dignity from the assumption that people like him always arrive late. The backstage hallway was designed to feel inevitable. Its carpeting muted everything into compliance. Its lights were set to a warm constellation that flattered faces without casting shadow. Its air conditioning moved sideways, so nothing ever fluttered. The wayfinding signs were an unobtrusive, modern font, as if even letters lowered their voices near important people. The velvet rope glowed with the authority of something soft that has never had to defend itself. He approached at a pace calibrated to signal composure. He held his badge where a guard could see it. It was the thick kind that doesn't fold, or bend, with a hologram in the corner that sparkled when it caught the light at a certain angle. On it, his name and university, his title and session time, and the word that gets rooms to stop moving. Keynote, VIPs only, said the guard, without looking at the badge. The hand landed at chest height and flattened, gentle in pressure, absolute in message. The guard's eyes were already scanning past him, as if what mattered about this person existed in the space behind his shoulders. I'm a keynote, he said, and he said it the way he would say the shelf is level, not defensive, not bragging, not anything other than a descriptive fact. He tipped the badge so it faced up, so angle and glare couldn't take the place of attention. The guard's gaze slid to the badge, then back to what the face suggested to his training. Speakers are escorted by stage managers, he said. Staff entrance around the side. You can wait there and someone will get you. He used the voice he had practiced for the situations that required both clarity and care. How to defend a boundary without bruising the person knocking against it. I have a call time in 25 minutes, he said. You can radio the stage manager, or you can call the organizer listed on the program next to my name. We can do it either way. The woman in the blue dress arrived. Her lanyard hung with so many credentials, it looked like a medal rack. She smiled at the guard first, the way people do when they are used to power moving out of earshot before they speak frankly. What's happening? She asked, and the guard answered for both of them. He says he's the keynote, he said, and the word says hung in the air like a disclaimer, like a story someone tells when they know a better one. Do you have your escort? The woman asked him, turning now, professional smile still pinned. In place. We require all talent to be accompanied. He could have said, It's not a requirement. It's a courtesy. He could have said, I've been here longer than you've been in your shoes. He could have said, the policy you're citing is not a policy. It's a feeling put into words when you've got the wrong feeling about the wrong person. Instead, he said, if you radio backstage, I can proceed to green room. If you'd prefer, you can call the stage manager by name. He spoke the name softly and watched it register surprise, watched it crack the woman's certainty, watched the guard's shoulders lean back the way people lean when the room tips a degree, and they need their bodies to pretend it hasn't. Behind him, there were footsteps and the quiet murmur of professionals arranging nerves. A journalist checking a mic. A young engineer running a line under her breath to hear how it fit in her mouth. A public utility director with a go bag and a stare worn soft by disasters. They were waiting for the rope to mean what it meant and watching to see what it meant. For him, two men walked past without breaking stride. One wore a hoodie with a bird mascot, badge flipped backward. One wore a navy blazer and the entitlement of hurry. The guard's hand did not find their chests. The rope parted as if sensing their approach and leaning aside. The woman in the blue dress smiled and touched the elbow of the man in the blazer. They're waiting for you, she said, and he nodded as if of course they were. He felt the heat rise in his neck and the way his breath wanted to climb into his throat. He walked a couple inches out of his body and watched himself, an old trick learned by people who have been told they are too sensitive about things that bruise as hard as fists. He heard his mother say, you can be right and be heard, or you can be right and be done. He chose to be heard. Please radio the stage, he said. I'm here. I'm on time. I'd like to do my job. The woman sighed, the way people sigh when they are about to be gracious, and pulled the radio to her mouth. Looking for stage, she said. I have Dr. Okafor. She spelled out his name into static, lifting the vowels like a shrug. The answer came back fast. He's our keynote. Let him through. Escort to green room. Oh, said the woman, a small word with a large history. Of course. The guard's hand drifted away from Malik's chest in a way that pretended it had never been there. The rope unclipped with a soft click that felt, absurdly, like apology dot. He didn't move at first. He had learned to give himself the 3 count before he stepped into the dignity he wanted to preserve. 1, so the body can remember it belongs. 2, so the mind can file the moment where it goes. 3, so the voice can come out with the temperature. He picks. Then he stepped forward, his hard case rolling a half beat behind like a drum in a procession. Backstage, a different world. Headsets and gaff tape and the useful tenderness of professionals whose job is to keep humans looking more natural than they feel. A woman with a coil of cable at her hip clipped a mic to his lapel and tucked the wire with the intimacy of a seamstress and the reverence of a liturgist. Water? She asked. Breath? He nodded, took both. The stage manager checked a cue, looked up, and gave him a look that held half the country in it. I saw. I'm sorry. You've got 5 in the wing. He counted the breaths he had practiced. He listened to the murmur of 1,000 people become a hush. He let the heat drop out of his face. He thought about systems and doors and the difference between the errors you fix with a software patch and the errors you fix by teaching a person to see what is actually in front of them. He thought, not for the first time, about how often the same people are asked to be both injured and instructive. When he walked out, the lights rose to meet him, and the applause was both for what they knew and for what they did not. He put his case beside the lectern, glanced at the monitor, found his first slide waiting like a held breath. Before we talk about keeping things running, he said, voice steady over the hush, let me tell you a story about a door that forgot why it had been built. there are two ways to answer a slight. One is to swallow it until your throat hurts and pretend you have no appetite. The other is to turn it into a lesson that makes the next person's walk a little easier. He had spent a life trying to pick the second whenever he could. So he told the room exactly what had happened, not as a complaint, not as an indictment of a single person, but as an example of how processes fracture when they rely on pattern matching. Instead of verification, he held up his badge and showed the hologram that caught the light just so. "This is a control," he said. "It's meant to answer a question. Are you who you say you are?" The control fails when we ignore it and substitute speed for certainty. He described a system any conference could adopt in a week. Handheld scanners that pull up registered headshots alongside roles, so a quick glance at a face becomes a check against a database rather than a preference for familiarity. He suggested that scripts for security could be written to center policy rather than instinct, and he offered examples of language that de-escalates while it verifies. He proposed a visible escalation path, one number, one person, so that the burden of proof doesn't always sit on the person whose identity is doubted. He made logistics feel like care. Then he put the badge down and picked up the country. He shifted to the talk he had written, because it was the one he had promised, and because the thing he had just experienced was also the thing he had come to explain. "Our infrastructure," he said, "is a network of promises. We promise water will run when you turn the tap. We promise an ambulance will arrive when you dial 3 numbers. We promise the lights will glow when your child flips a switch at 6 a.m. before a test. When the promises break, they don't break randomly. They break along the old fault lines, the familiar cracks, the places where stress has been stored for generations." He offered 3 stories of failure and 3 stories of repair. A heat dome turned a city into a kill, and those without air conditioning were left to invent. Geography crowding into libraries and supermarkets and shelters that had outlets and didn't ask questions. A cyber attic laced through a hospital. System and turned clinic computers into silent tiles while paper and memory and neighborly luck filled the gap. A flood rolled through a valley, and the second levee held, because in the years after the first one broke, the woman who had lost her brother to the water had learned the names of everyone who had authority over mud and concrete, and she used those names like levers. He talked about redundancy as love and about equity as a maintenance plan that refuses to forget the least shiny part of the city. He talked about maps that lie and dashboards that flatter, and the way spreadsheets circle themselves under the fluorescent light of a meeting room and get promoted to truth. He talked about how you fix a system without breaking the people who hold it up, and the room listened the way people listen when something they have believed privately is being said in public in a way that makes it feel safe to believe it more. That night, in the hotel room with the carpet too soft to be trusted, he answered emails until midnight. Messages from strangers who had recognized their own hallway under his words. Messages from students who had never seen someone explain failing doors without throwing anyone under a bus. Messages from colleagues and leaders and from a dozen security professionals who had built their careers on keeping people safe and had long understood that suspicion is a blunt instrument and the sharp ones are better. He thought about his father's soldering iron and the patience it required, and about his mother's gentle insistence that the story you tell yourself about the world will determine how you treat your neighbors by morning. The incident had done the thing these incidents do. It had grown its own legs and walked beyond the room. People told it in subtitles of their own lives. A brilliant woman turned away at the door of a gala she was funding. A professor pointed toward the service elevator at a conference where her photo stood on a poster. It was never one door. It was always all of them. He made a list. It was not a list of grievances. It was an action list. He asked the conference organizers for a meeting before his flight. He requested time with the operations lead as well as the program chair. He brought the guard's name only to the person whose job it was to train him. He insisted the meeting include a security contractor representative and a stage manager. He opened with this sentence, "I'm here to help you make your process match your purpose." He gave them the 3 changes again, this time with pricing estimates and vendors and lead times, because in organizations, nothing moves without numbers and certainty. He added one more, compensate those harmed by the failure of your process. With more than an apology, make the apology easy to access. Make it human. Train every frontline worker in bias literacy the way you train them in fire code and evacuation paths. He left the meeting with a promise that sounded, for once, like a plan. He got on an early evening flight and stared out the window at a cloud, texture that looked like someone had shaved the sky. He imagined 1,000 doors learning their names again. He thought about what his mother would ask when he called. Did you make it easier for the next person? He tried to sleep and couldn't, and he opened the Notes app on his phone and wrote down the bones of something that might be bigger than a meeting. An initiative, a set of standards, a way to teach the people who build corridors how to remember why they were built. The call came 10 days later. It began with a sentence that meant both power and risk. We've got a problem we need your help to solve, and we don't want to fix it with a press release. The Global Systems Summit had reviewed its footage. They had interviewed staff. They had pulled badge scans and checkpoint logs. The story wasn't defensible as a misunderstanding. It was what it looked like. And to their credit, they weren't asking him to help them do damage control. They were asking him to build something that would make this less likely next time. They offered budget and access and a timeline that was ambitious without being insulting. They asked him to lead a working group that would include not just conference organizers, but also contracted security companies, venue managers, stage crews, and a handful of people who had stories like his and receipts to match. He said yes, with conditions. The group would be diverse in rank as well as identity. The people at checkpoints would be paid to help design the process they would be bound by. The standard would carry teeth in the form of procurement preference and public certification. They met twice a week for 8 weeks. In those meetings, language softened and sharpened and softened again. They mapped the current process and then mapped the actual process, which everyone admitted was an accumulation of what we do when it's busy. They listed the moments when bias could leak in and named them one by one, not as accusations, but as points of failure like any other. They borrowed from safety culture, where even a near miss gets logged so the next person can learn. They borrowed from human-centered design, where the person who touches the thing most often gets to speak first. They borrowed from the practical genius of people who manage crowds without crushing anyone's dignity. They wrote the standard in plain language first. Then they translated it into procedure, then into training scripts, then into signage drafts. That dignified rather than instructed. They created a one-tap escalation system that sent a stage manager to a checkpoint when a badge scan and a face didn't seem to match the person's role. And they set a timer on the escalation so that the person waiting didn't have to stand in social jeopardy indefinitely. They piloted handheld scanners that pulled up headshots next to role names. They designed a second-look protocol that desk-killed the gut check. If a person was held up at a rope and released within 2 minutes after a manager arrived, the incident got logged with a flag and a debrief so the lesson didn't die at shift change. They built a training module that treated bias literacy like real content, not corporate wallpaper. It asked trainees to rehearse scripts that centered both safety and respect. It taught them what to do when they recognized race as a variable in their decision-making. It didn't shame. It didn't coddle. It built muscle memory for a different reflex, Those who took the training said it felt like someone had bothered to teach them a thing they were always punished for failing at. The day they launched the standard, the summit committed to more than this year's news cycle. They announced a certification that other conferences could earn. They made the materials free. They created a dashboard where incidents could be logged without names, so patterns would be visible and fixes could be targeted. They put money behind it, not just their logo. They published the names of the people, stage managers and guards and frontline staff who had helped design the thing. That would now make their jobs both easier and more humane. At the launch, he stood to the side and watched a guard scan a badge and see a headshot pop up and smile a smile that looked like relief. He watched a woman in a blue dress, maybe this one, maybe any of 100, ask a question with curiosity instead of gatekeeping and get an answer that led to the same door opening, but without the little hum of harm. He watched someone hit the escalation button and a stage manager arrive in seconds and say the person's name like a hand extended from a boat to a dock. He took the podium when it was his turn and said the sentence he had written on the plane. A good door doesn't just keep the wrong people out. It knows how to welcome the right people in. The applause rose and softened. He thought about how someone would try to turn this into a press release with rounded edges, and how his job now was to keep the edges honest enough to do the work. When he walked off stage this time, no palm found his chest. The rope felt like fabric instead of law. He shook hands with the guard who had scanned the badge and thanked him for the work that had made the day less likely to fray. It was a small thing. It was an enormous thing. It was both, and he let it be both. In the months that followed, the standard spread the way healthy things spread. One person who had been embarrassed in public sent it to a colleague who was tired of apologizing. One venue manager who hated mopping up after a mess he didn't make insisted it be a condition of the next contract. One executive who wanted an easy fix learned there wasn't one and signed anyway because the harder fix the deeper problem. Conferences borrowed it in pieces and then, finding the pieces worked, adopted it all. The upstream effect was what he had hoped for and what he had argued for in every room that would listen. Procurement became a lever. Venues that wanted the contracts trained their staff. Contractors that wanted the work built the scans and the scripts into their onboarding. The rope rose and fell as it always had, but beneath it, the process changed. He took the money the summit had offered him for the working group and used it to seed a nonprofit with a name that made room for both accountability and welcome. It did not aim to become a compliance empire. It aimed to become unnecessary. It wrote case studies and offered workshops and asked to be invited into boardrooms before the next embarrassment made humility the only affordable posture. It assembled a council of the people whose names rarely appear in the back pages of programs, and it paid them to tell the truth about what worked and what didn't. He went back to the work he loved, the kind that starts with a city map spread across a table and ends in air that is cleaner, water that is safer, electrons that show up where they ought to and don't arc where they shouldn't. He carried the story with him, not as a wound so much as a tool, useful in the rooms where leaders needed a reason to extend their attention span by 15 minutes. He kept learning, because the people who hurt you do not deserve to become the center of your life. He kept teaching, because the people who come after you deserve a quieter hallway. The letters came. A young scientist wrote from a conference where, twice in one day, she had been mistaken for staff, and the second time she pulled out the certification the venue had earned from his nonprofit, and the guard apologized before the stage manager even arrived, and she got to her talk without needing to perform a tightrope walk with her smile. A director of security wrote and said the training had given his staff language for a thing they had always fumbled with and were tired of being blamed for. A woman who wore a blue dress at a different conference wrote a note that was short and plain. "I'm sorry. I learned. Thank you for not making me a villain when I behaved like one." He returned to Columbus for a visit and found his father at the kitchen table with a circuit board the size of a paperback and 2 grandchildren watching with faces so serious it made him want to laugh. They took turns holding the soldering iron under supervision, and when they passed the tool between them, he saw something like a lineage in the way their hands moved. They asked him to tell the story again, the one about the rope, and he did, making the guard a little kinder and the room a little gentler, because he wanted the lesson to live without curdling. He told them the sentence they would need to know when the world looked away from them: "You are allowed to be in the rooms your work has built for you." He kept a copy of his badge on his desk, not as a trophy, as a control, a physical reminder of how something designed to declare truth can be ignored by a glance, and of how a process that enforces a glance can be redesigned to enforce the truth instead. The hollow in the corner still caught the light like water. A year later, he was in another hallway, a different building, a different rope. The guard scanned his badge and looked at the screen, and then at his face, and smiled a smile that reached his eyes. "Welcome, Dr. Okafor," he said. "We're glad you're here." It was a sentence so simple it felt like a lullaby. He walked through the opening it made and thought, this is how it starts. Not with trumpets, but with procedural kindness repeated so often it becomes culture. There's a temptation to end a story like this with a parade. The door that refused now opens. The rope that snagged is smooth. The lesson has been learned, and will stay learned. And when we're finished clapping at the neatness of it, we forget that systems drift back toward their most comfortable errors, unless people keep reminding them of their purpose. What happened in a carpeted hallway before a keynote was not an isolated rudeness. It was a small expression of a larger habit, deciding who belongs by instinct instead of by evidence, by familiarity instead of by fact. It breaks hearts. It also breaks systems, because the same reflex that keeps a person from a stage keeps someone from safety, and the same failure that humiliates a keynote can humiliate a nurse, a teacher, a student, a neighbor who needs the door to open when it is supposed to. If you build doors literal or figurative, build them to remember why they exist. If you manage ropes, write the scripts that make them softer and smarter. If you staff checkpoints, insist on tools that don't ask you to be a mind reader or a lie detector. If you run a room, be the person who arrives when someone presses the escalation button and arrive with a name and a plan, not just a posture. If you carry a badge that says you belong, know that belonging is not a favor you are granted. It's a fact your work has made. Carry yourself accordingly. And when your chest meets a palm, and you have the breath to do it, say the line out loud. Please call the person in charge. I am here. I am on time. I would like to do my job. Say it for yourself. Say it for the person watching, who will need to hear the words in their own mouth one day. Then, when the rope clicks open, step through. Other feet are coming behind you. The sound you hear is not only your own. It's a promise, learning how to keep itself.